dare to become relevant. I think in the history of man that is not at all unique. In a way, what I would like to leave most is never to submit to the idea that you have to produce something, but always have the delight of discoveries drive the process. Well, AMO is a parallel office. We found it in, I think it was end of the 90s. I mean, it's hard to pinpoint the exact day, but it was in a way an office to contain a lot of activities which we were already doing anyway, but which never saw the light of day as activities in their own right. In other words, we did buildings, but we did a lot of thinking and a lot of theorizing that went into these buildings and a master plan. But then as an architect, you're in the funny situation that as soon as your building doesn't get realized, everything you thought, everything you built up in terms of knowledge, tends to be washed down the drain along with the failure of not having realized your building. So therefore it's if you don't pay any specific attention to making the thinking somewhat autonomous and somewhat independent from the built end result, you're in danger of losing it and inventing the wheel time and again and again and again. And you also don't practice architecture as a form of knowledge per se. And then in the end of the 90s, there was an increasing number of clients that came to us essentially for strategic advice. Essentially, they all wanted a building or a master plan or anything of that sort. But they wanted that further down the line, and it became quite clear that they struggled with entirely different problem. And through conversations with them, we found out that we could be of better service for them if we did a different type of projects with them. So we had wanted to, we had basically been writing books about our work and doing a lot of work in the academic circuit up until then, which was in a way a form of autonomizing our research, in a way of existing as a cultural practice next to a professional practice. But at the end of the 90s, the first real professional or commercial opportunities came to kind of see that side of our work not as the kind of cultural philanthropy, but as a legitimate part of our business as well. So from then on, it provided us the opportunity that the cultural side of our that the cultural side of our practice could actually become part of the business. I mean, it's basically a very vulgar reasoning, but that's when we formally set up an independent entity with an independent tax number, with an independent, etc., etc., etc. So, but it's an idea we had at a much longer time, and in a way. And the fact that it became an independent entity also meant that we could market it as an independent entity, as a kind of selling point of our office, etc., etc. So that's where we do everything that we know doesn't lead to results. Then we got a chance to work on renewable energy. And energy is particularly a domain in which there is a clear a benefit that can be demonstrated, that can be translated into numbers for every country of Europe, that to show that when they act collectively, they're better off than when they act individually. And that's always a bit of a tall order. I mean, everybody knows that, but until you can prove it concretely in a particular domain, everybody's going to have the reflex to, and there's a lot of nationalism, particularly in the current climate. Also, Europe started as the European Union as a political system started as an industrial project to integrate the coal and steel industries of Germany and France shortly after the war, so they wouldn't go to war together, but also as a very practical thing, in a way to avoid political rhetoric, but to work on something practical. And if you look at Europe, and if this in a presentation, it's always the kind of practical projects like the high-speed rail network, like the Channel Tunnel, like Galileo, where Europe is incredibly successful. It's the political, even the euro. I mean, I don't know if we have this interview in 3 weeks from now. I maybe can't include that anymore. But where it's about practical forms of collaboration, it is actually quite an impressive entity. So for us to work on renewable energy, was a very interesting chance to talk about an integrated Europe again on the back of that subject. And it's quite a simple proposition. If you imagine a Europe which largely becomes dependent on wind, solar, tidal, geothermal and hydro energy, you simply need a united Europe. Because, I mean, you have wind in the north, you have sun in the south, etc., etc. But you don't always have sun in the south, you don't always have wind in the north. So there are seasonal fluctuations which make all these energy types, when regarded individually, very, very volatile. And at the same time you have a constant demand for energy, so that only once you integrate them can actually the presence of one make up for the absence of the other at any given time. So we imagined a kind of an integrated, a little bit like what Buckminster Fuller did for the whole world in the 60s, an integrated network in Europe of kind of energy superhighways, so that very quickly solar energy could be transported from Spain to the north, that hydro could be transported to the south, so that you had a robust system of energy provision that could deal with all the seasonal or geographic fluctuations at any given time, because anything could make up for anything else at a given time. Well, it's a very simple idea. So then this is a kind of a translation of that energy network, partly based on the existing energy lines, partly based on the introduction and upgrading. And then as a provocative statement, we in a way imagined a Europe not of countries, but of regions whose primary identity was derived from the particular sort of energy that was gotten. So geothermalia, the carbon capture storage republic, in the solar hydro, blah, 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 blah. It's a bit of a joke, but in a way it's again like our barcode was a bit of a joke. It was the rhetoric image which in a way served as a front for the whole exercise that got landed in the media, and that got the whole exercise an enormous amount of attention. And that's of course also our tragedy, that in a way the most frivolous joke, which is like almost a little more than icing on the cake, actually is the thing that propels the thing forward. Well, sometimes it simply takes 40 years for an idea to become relevant. I think in the history of man that is not at all unique. I think in the history of man that is even a relatively short period. Between the inceptions in somebody's brain and something eventually coming round, sometimes it takes a century. That idea from the 60s basically acquired a new relevance in the context of renewable energy, because the need to interlink different regions and different climatical conditions simply becomes greater. I mean, Buckminster Fuller linked out of some idea that once you shared and once you integrated, you would need less, which is generally true. I mean, once you have an integral approach, you save. Once you have a fragmented approach, you waste. But it was limited in a way at that kind of intuition. And again, renewable energy puts numbers to that, concretely proves that. There is a scientific case in the meantime that backs up an intuitive notions from 40 years before. And yeah. And we have no problem actually. I mean, we have less and less of a problem admitting that a lot of our inspiration comes from a period in architecture which is in many ways most discarded. If we are postmodernists, which maybe we are, we take our inspiration from a past, but it's an incredibly recent past. It's a past which history has almost overlooked, and therefore our profession can mistake it for originality. And I mean, in the end, the conclusion of the energy report was that that in a way this approach could not be translated blanket across the world. Also, what came in the energy report of the whole world, because of course renewable energy relies a lot on electrification, but then there are huge parts of the world. I mean, 1 in every 4 people in the world currently, I think, is denied access to proper electricity. So that also means that for a long time you will have to probably rely on different things while that electrification is taking place. I mean, it's from the energy report, it's clear that bioenergy, in the scenario the World Wildlife Fund conjured up, that bioenergy will play a huge role in a way in taking care of a transitory state which will take quite some time. That if you want to go to 100% renewables in 2050, that it's going to be another 50 years before you actually can eliminate biofuels as well. I mean, that creates an interesting situation in a world where already food prices are on the rise. You in a way organize a competition between energy provision and food provision. So this scenario, I would say, is not entirely without risk. Yes, it addresses CO2 emission, but it may well trade CO2 emissions in for far more immediate and serious problems, which make CO2 emissions seem like a luxury. And in that sense, it's what became clear in working on a global scale and in working on Russia is that, as opposed to working in Europe, that you have to tread incredibly carefully, and that it's enormously important not to take the same type of euphoric approach as you can do in a relatively wealthy, and well-equipped part of the world. This is a list of, I think, all our projects of OMA since it was started in the 70s. It's probably longer, but I mean it's as far as we can remember. This is the projects that didn't happen. So this is projects that were projects and that remained projects that did not lead to execution. So if you talk about the shift from being an architect to somebody who deals with something virtual, I would argue that an architect for 75% by definition in a professional practice deals with virtual things. It goes back to what I said in the beginning. A lot of your endeavor is dedicated to things that don't lead to execution. So a lot of your endeavors is in the end doomed to remain knowledge or remain, maybe this was the need to know. It's the red thing. And I don't think the transition in the end is so great, because even when you do a building as an architect, you're for a significant part clueless. If you do a hospital, for instance, you are at the mercy of a team of specialists which all deal with individual components of which they know far more than you do. You almost act as an integrator of all those specialisms, and hopefully you're the one with a good common sense. But like a journalist, and that goes back, you are one of the last remaining generalists, one of the last types of profession that is actually aimed at making a synthesis rather than pursuing a specialism. And a journalist is that, of course, as well, that with knowing bits and pieces of everything, you make a story and you make a narrative. And particularly when you act with decision makers or politicians, that is a very, very key competence. So we often find ourselves actually simultaneously completely powerless as completely powerful in a way that so in a way I don't think it's that much of a transition. I think all of what I ended up doing is already embedded in the root of what our profession is. This is a series of words, a series of terms which all relate to architecture, which all have an architectural meaning, but invariably in today's business jargon, military jargon, political jargon, these are invariably more used in their metaphorical meaning than in their literal architectural meaning, which suggests that architecture as a grammar or as a universe of knowledge has somehow also a competence embedded to speak about a lot more things than construction. When is something an infographic? I don't know, because I mean, I think there has been a gradual transition in our work, whereas I mean, a lot of our early infographics were data visualization, which I'm getting quite sick of in the end, because it's in a way a kind of ass-covering detour to saying what you eventually want to say. And where I find our work most interesting is when it's like this, when it's almost like something very something that could be taken out of a children's book, but is incredibly evocative. So when you make a complex issue incredibly immediate, and immediate to the point that even here, and in the case of the barcode, even language becomes obsolete. And in that sense, that it then almost ventures into the domain of art, that it's even to a certain point meaningless. Because anything that is a translation of numbers nowadays leads to somebody else that you presented to mentioning another number from another source, and then you get caught in the same trap that before you know it, you have a specialist discussion when you actually would like to have a discussion on a more general level. We take a lot of inspiration from. See if I can find it. From propaganda posters. This was in the end when we worked on that earlier project that I mentioned for European identity. This is a poster that won a competition for the German Marshall Fund in 1948 to visualize the future of Europe. And the interesting thing, Europe was in a way a ship propelled forward by a series of sails that were the individual countries. So here you have, in a way, a very eloquent way of visualizing a common cause without sacrificing the national identities. And if you compare that to the European blue flag, which supposes a single identity, supposes like a superstate, it's that symbol is prone to all the wrong interpretations. Whereas I think this one, in an immediate way, conveys quite a subtle and complicated message. Well, not complicated message, but a deliberately ambiguous message. And we live in an age of media where so many crude, strong imagery actually is at odds with the truth more often than that it actually represents the truth. Well, our buildings are modern, and in that sense, they're by definition not national, because no nation has a monopoly on modernism, and in architecture it's in many ways accepted to be modern. Most well-known architects are now modern architects of sorts who operate internationally. So our reality as practicing architects is already an integrated Europe, or is already a globalized world, etc., etc., etc. Whereas, of course, for large segments of society, that is a lot less evident. So we also, in part and parcel, make a case for something which we already, as architects, inhabit. And I'm aware that maybe not every architect inhabits that, but our reality is already a long way along these lines. And so I'm not sure if you can say that the discovery, for instance, in the European project necessarily transforms our architecture. I think it's different. What was quite interesting for us, that it influences the way in which we argue for our architecture, and that often in difficult regions or situations you find unexpected allies, or you find moments in the history of the region which is unexpected proof or support for the approach you're taking. That it was, for instance, in the work we did in Dubai, which of course in many ways in its present form is like an orgy of kitsch, that actually in the 70s the Middle East had our oil crisis, which was their oil boom, had fostered a whole wave of modern architects where there's even mini realizations of metabolist projects, where Kenzo Tanga had an impressive career in a place like Saudi Arabia, that you find fragments like that once you step back and you start looking at a region calmly, so that you can also shed a light there on part of a history that is quickly forgotten. So, and in that sense, it in a way it provides a context and a discourse. More than that, I think it necessarily it's maybe it influences the building, but it's hard to put it into words. And I'm always, because many people ask this question, and I'm always a little shy to put it into words, because it's difficult to say. And it's yeah, and it's such. I mean, making a building anyway is such an intuitive process in many ways. I mean, apart from all our theorizing and all our writing and all our discourse. I mean, whenever we work on buildings, I can assure you it is, you know, pretty basic, and there's a lot of underbelly also involved here, as I'm sure there is anywhere. You know, I mean, there's many of our embassies abroad who want to invite us over and flag us as a, you know, an exponent of Dutch design. We always are somewhat uncomfortable with that. I mean, it's 85% of our office is not Dutch. This is like Dubai in the sense that 85% of the people who inhabit this place is from all over the world. The spoken language in our office is English. The Dutch are a minority. But in a weird way, I do also think that that is somehow a Dutch thing, to kind of be able to welcome that on its territory in such a kind of relaxed way. For me, goes back to one of the things that at least I always thought was good about the Netherlands. I mean, if I look at the current political landscape and climate, I begin to develop my doubts. But let's say for somebody of my age, I do not know better that kind of welcoming attitude to outside influence, that kind of curiousness to outside influence is part of our culture. So in that sense, by not being an exponent of Dutch design in your own country, you are very Dutch. That's you know what I'm saying? It's a very weird thing. It's also, I mean, almost everyone in the Netherlands speaks quite good English. I mean, there is almost irrespective of the level of education, the whole country speaks English. The vast majority of people, and that is also, our television is not dubbed, it's subtitled. I mean, there's all these kind of things that there is embedded, since it's a small country that at one point was a kind of big shipping nation. There is an interest in everything that comes from the outside. So I think that's one thing, and that's a very complicated way of being Dutch. I mean, you can be Dutch by not insisting that you're Dutch or that you have to be Dutch. Secondly, I think our office works differently because it really works as a collective. It really works as a studio. I think MVRDV works like that to a certain point as well. I think some of the more well-known star architects like that, I mean, you mentioned Calatrava, work like that at all. I mean, there you know what you're going to get because there is a signature, there is a style. That's the style of the office. The office will do well until that style goes out of fashion. Whereas here, there really is not a predefined style. I mean, there is a group of people which is composed in a certain way because we think they might have something to say on the subject of the project, that goes at it. And what comes out is as much the result of editing as it is of creation or of instruction. I mean, there is in a way a number of questions that drive the project, but very little predefined solutions. And then a kind of a keen eye on behalf of the office and a kind of critical eye that in the end determines the end product. So the end product I mean, many of those tends to be very diverse. And if there is a consistent factor, it's in a way a certain way of thinking or a certain mentality, I guess, rather than a style consistency in the whole thing. And in the fact that there is an ethos in the office, that a project is good when it even can withstand the most basic, obvious criticism. I mean, it's another thing, and I do think that's very Dutch, actually, that there is no desire to shun the obvious. I mean, our office has some very intellectual and insightful moments, but I can assure you it also has incredibly banal moments, and even with very basic, practical, obvious criticisms. And I think that's a very Dutch thing too, that it's in the end not a nation of highbrow, but also a very down-to-earth nation that also at the right moments treasures its banality. This was Rotterdam in 1945. You know, the whole center had been bombed out, but the demolition work of the bombed houses had been completed, but no reconstruction work had started. So it's like a clean slate with kind of few buildings left. Then this was Rotterdam, let's say, in the 60s. After the first wave of reconstruction had been completed, you could describe it as a modern city, as a kind of a showcase of modernity that had been used to recreate a city which actually had a center as old and as vintage as, for instance, Amsterdam or Utrecht. But this is Rotterdam in the meantime, if we look out of our window. I mean, there have been successive revisions of the modernist ideology to the point that you cannot really say that Rotterdam is a modern city anymore. It's an amalgamation of styles. I mean, in other words, it's a mess. But it's a very nice anarchistic mess in which you feel, as an architect, quite free to operate because you can almost do no damage. Then, yeah, this is the 60s, this is the 70s. A whole revisionist movement with Piet Blom, with this, with kind of all of this stuff, and it almost looks like a Breugel painting, like a medieval Breugel painting. And actually, this is later than that. So, in that sense, Rotterdam also is a nice embodiment of the successful architectural doctrines that have basically been dominating the architectural debate since the war. The next wave was, of course, a whole high-rise approach in the city. That the center had to be transformed into a kind of downtown. With, well, at least for Dutch standards, many high buildings. But in a way, what this building tries to do is that it doesn't try to add another form to the city. It's deliberately, well, in not very flattering terms, it's a kind of formless heap, because it doesn't want to introduce the nth architectural style. It doesn't want to kind of claim a universal truth beyond its own plot, and it kind of, you know, it doesn't preach, but it kind of coexists with everything that had been there. This is, I mean, if it's anything, it's modular. And it had to be a very public building, hence the free ground floor, and it had to be a very sustainable building. It had to be the most sustainable building in the Netherlands, although that's a little bit like being king in the land of the blind. But we took an approach that the Dutch word for sustainable is duurzaam, which means also durable, which has a notion of building for eternity, that you are sustainable when you build something that is useful forever. Whereas we had the idea that in today's world is a bit of a fiction, because things change, and if a thing is to be sustainable, it has to be adaptable rather than durable. So we took a building that you could build very quickly, but you could also demolish it very quickly. You could take it apart and end up with the same spare parts that you'd use to put it together, almost like a tent. I mean, there is 4 steel prefabricated elements that can be used to erect the whole building. Those elements all have standard dimensions that many speculative office buildings have as well. So these elements can, in theory, be taken back again and used somewhere else to create a different kind of building. But also, of course, you can take some elements away and reuse them somewhere else, so you can subtract and add bits even over time. So the building could change shape even in the face of programmatic changes. And that was so the whole idea of recycling, the whole idea of being temporary rather than eternal was a very important part in arguing for the sustainability of this building. So in a way, it's a very counterintuitive approach, because it broke with a number of the presupposition that exist around the subject of sustainability. So, and then this is the monument from the 50s that is there. It sort of fills that, touches that building partially. This whole thing is a Vierendeel ligger. in the sense that there's no diagonals, but in a way the structural height is identical to a floor height, 3.6 meter. So it's like really a bit of inhabited structure. It cantilevers out from these 2 points. It clears the ground where the public part of the town hall is located, but it only touches this building on the very top, so that in a way the facade of the new hall is actually the old facade. The internal facade of the new hall is the old external facade of the old building. So you have an element of history as the backdrop of your town hall. So anyway, it's been approved. They're demolishing whatever is currently in here, and it looks like it will be built. This is actually the presentation that won us the project. The first shift was here that we actually stayed within the height limit and built less high than less than the maximum we were allowed. This was the envelope, kind of slab on a podium, etc., and we transformed that into that thing where we were actually lower, where the apartments essentially had these outside terraces, so that also in the middle of the city, on the 20th floor, you could live like you were living in the suburbs. With a garden, so that there would also be a kind of a renewed appeal to live in the heart of the city, even to those who actually preferred the conditions of outside the city. So it sort of tries to densify, etc., etc. We were interested in Strelka, simply because Strelka is in Russia. We're interested in Russia as a territory with a particular type of history, and we ourselves had a great need to know about Russia, and Strelka seemed the perfect vehicle in a way to do that, because you can look at Russia with young Russians, explore the themes which are relevant for Russia, and Russia is of course confronted with so many serious problems that in a way you can use Russia as a kind of magnifying lens for phenomena that go on in the world at large. I mean, for instance, the wholesale evacuation of the countryside. I mean, an enormous territory that is not urban but rural, in which fewer and fewer people inhabit an ever larger territory. I mean, in other words, Siberia, for instance, is an example of what is left in the wake of urbanization. I mean, the whole world urbanizes. More than 50% of people lives in cities now. Of course, that leaves something behind. I mean, that leaves behind a vast territory with ever fewer people. That leaves behind shrinking cities. That leaves behind the dismantling of a certain amount of infrastructure, for instance, built in Soviet times. And that type of dismantling, we feel, is an interesting subject for a world increasingly governed by asymmetries. And for instance, I believe there were 1,300 something airports in the Soviet Union before the Soviet Union ended. I think in the current territory of the former Soviet Union, there are about 300 airports left. There are entire railroads, tracks which are no longer used. I mean, there is a certain decay, of a certain retreat of people on a smaller territory, leaving something behind that is a phenomenally compelling subject to look at. And those things we are looking, I personally am looking in an extension of these projects, if it's conceivable to ever have a renewable energy future for Russia, because I mean, of course, Russia is currently blessed with huge reserves for oil and gas. That is very nice for them, but that also is a huge problem in a way for Russia, because it inspires on that front. It's a source of easy money, but it also creates an unimaginable lethargy. Is that in English? Lethargy. Yeah, lethargy in all other domains. It's very dispiriting to see that large parts of Russia, in terms of infrastructure, are almost like the Middle East today. You know, a country dominated by one resource, by one source of incoming, happily abandoning all other fields. I mean, they used to have phenomenally interesting pursuits of very many sciences. I mean, in the 90s, most of the sciences left for Silicon Valley or for Switzerland, and in that sense, it's I mean, to think about energy in a different way, in a more holistic way, is also from that point of view interesting. So it's more that what we're doing at Strelka than pursuing design per se. But I mean, Russia is Detroit on the scale of a country. Russia is Detroit, basically spread out over 11 time zones. And that's what makes it as a subject so interesting, is that, I mean, Detroit is a very radical example, but to some extent, even the most radical examples that we find in the West, I mean, it's you look at a glance in Russia and you find something 10 times more radical, whether it's like the legacy of the 70s, whether it's like prefabrication, whether it's like this kind of shrinkage, etc., etc. And that's where, as a subject, combined with, of course, an extreme denial of the market economy at one point and an extreme embrace of the market economy the next moment, which in a way is what a country like the Netherlands went through that as well. I mean, in the 70s, we were way more of a socialist welfare state than we are now, and it goes for England, France, it goes for North America, etc. But I mean, in the 90s, that shift was just surpassed by how radical that shift was there. I mean, they go from communism to some of the most vulgar forms of capitalism. And assuming you intend to do good when you do something, the goal is, of course, always to improve. But I mean, the goal of studying first is also identifying where you can be most effective in when you want to improve. I mean, and to some extent get an idea of how to operate effectively in a context like that, because in so many ways it's very different from us. Because the initial approach in our teaching on energy was that we would simply come, Europe is a big territory, Russia is an even bigger territory, we transplant this approach to Russia, and Russia is an even better example of where this would be good. And then 3 weeks into research, you realize that is totally fictional. You realize that you need, if you want to achieve the same goals, you need to go at it entirely differently. That you're dealing with an oil and gas sector which isn't going to roll over and play dead, that you deal with an extreme entanglement of politics and the oil and gas sector, that you deal, with an abundance of those type of resources which will for a long time be way cheaper than any alternative. So that you almost need to look at weaknesses in the system and find a good way to start rather than preaching a wholesale transformation. I mean, one of the things we found is that Russia has an enormous network of oil and gas lines, also an enormous electricity network planned by Lenin, almost planned like in less than 10 years. The electrification of a large part of the country happened, which was incredibly impressive. But at the same time, that network misses out a lot of people. I think there's about 20 million people in Russia which are not connected to that grid at all, which are kind of in remote parts, which live in very primordial conditions when it comes to energy. So it would be interesting to look at those communities, that if you do something for them, you don't connect them to an oil and gas grid, but that they, for instance, get a local renewable energy plan, so that you use renewable energy to address faults in the system rather than tell the system to change course overnight, and like a kind of an acupuncture treatment. So in that's and that's why it's always good to kind of go somewhere and look properly first before and to have that type of action precede by a need to know. Because I think if we would have acquired a renewable energy project immediately, we would have probably started with all the wrong assumptions. Well, Vincent Rijn makes his own things, which are very, very nice. He makes models for us, which are very, very nice. But when he makes models for us, he, in a way, is at the tail end of a design process in which many things have been thought out. He needs to kind of pick from those things what he wants to bring forward in order to convey in a very immediate way the essence of a project. But it's essentially a project that's finished. What in a way we have as a problem is that we need to imagine things before those things are invented. So it's the opposite thing, that when we make models, They're also very simplistic, but they're not simplistic by weeding things out. They're simplistic because we simply don't know everything. So we have to see something in something before it's there. He is almost trained to no longer see the things which are already there, to see the original idea again. So, do you know what I mean? It's a model like this was made, and currently we have the project. Currently we like the project. Currently we're convinced about the project. This was one of 40 different ideas how to inhabit this courtyard, which there were a number of them promising and a number of them not. But I mean, it's not so obvious that you choose this one. You know, and everything that I say about Rotterdam and you know, the layer of styles and not wanting to add another style, all of that is made up as you go along. I mean, the moment that we decide to pursue this direction, and that's what I mean, is also about the degree of underbelly in the practice, is simply what we feel is the most evocative idea. What we intuitively feel is the idea that simply will bring forward most of the next ideas. So it's a kind of an ability to see something into something where there is basically not that much to see yet. Yeah, and in the end, just scientific research and analysis and all of those things, that whenever people describe it like that, although I feel flattered, but in the back of my mind I also raise an eyebrow a little bit, because I mean, deep down I know how incredibly intuitive even those processes are, and also it's very weird that in a design process you have to work very hard, but the key element to success is the ability to delay. The ability to delay a decision until you know that you see what you see. And that is hugely exhausting at times, of course, because you have time pressure, you have deadlines, you need to do, and people expect things, etc., etc. And all the while you need to keep your head cool and delay until you're ready, until you see what you see. In that sense, and you need a delay. You almost need to look at the development in slow motion in order not to miss some very essential bits. In a way, what I would like to leave most is never to submit to the idea that you have to produce something, but always have the delight of discoveries drive the process. You know, and in that sense, your own intuition is as much of a measurement as any expectations placed upon you. And often when you rely on your own intuitions, you will find that in the end you are more ambitious than when you simply kind of try to fulfill expectations. And in the face of a lot of pressures, I think that is an important thing to kind of keep close to yourself at all times. You know, it's in the end, in the end I always say it's not me who does it, but it's you. You know, and in the end, I mean, one of the lines I use frequently is that what I like best in an educational context is to simply be a spectator. And once that happens, it works best, you know. A spectator with the occasional snide comment. But